This is Inside PHLCouncil, bringing you the latest news from Philadelphia City Council, straight from the source. Inside PHLCouncil is hosted by Joe Grace and Patty Gillette.
Welcome back to Inside PHLCouncil, a podcast brought to you by the communications team for City Council and City Council President Darrell Clark. I'm Joe Grace.
And I'm Patty Gillette.
As usual, we have a lot to talk about today, and we have a pretty dynamic interview coming up with Councilmember Kendra Brooks, the first third-party member of council in the city's modern history. We're going to dive right in. Patty, we have to start with COVID-19. What's happening in Philadelphia?
There's a lot going on, Joe. The latest city numbers are as follows. The city announced 700 additional confirmed cases of COVID-19 on Tuesday. That would be Tuesday, April 6th. That brings the total number of confirmed cases to 126,759 in Philadelphia since the start of the pandemic in March 2020.
Wow.
Sadly, 3,293 Philadelphians have died from this virus. Currently, we have 490 patients with COVID-19 in Philadelphia hospitals, with 52 on ventilators. We say that because we're tracking our hospital capacity. Our hospitals aren't yet over capacity, but numbers are rising, and that's troubling.
Right.
Cases are rising. Our 7-day average hovered around 500 new cases a day last week. So again, we said we had 700 yesterday.
Mm-hmm.
So as I said, cases are rising, not just in Philadelphia, not just in Pennsylvania. In fact, nearly half of the new coronavirus infections nationwide are from just 5 states: New York, Pennsylvania, New Jersey, Michigan, and Florida. In the last 7-day period, 44% of the nation's new cases, 197,500 cases, were reported in just these 5 states, and that includes Pennsylvania.
Wow.
So that puts pressure on the federal government to consider how it's distributing vaccines. Should they send more doses to these hotspots? It can get complicated to answer that question. Experts say, on one hand, you don't want to necessarily make folks wait longer for vaccines just because their state is doing better. On the other hand, it makes logical sense to send vaccines to states where the cases are rising. The other question is, are those cases in those states just the hotspots? Because we know we just came off an Easter holiday. A lot of those cases can be attributed to travel. If we send doses to those states, are those necessarily going to be the hotspots in 2 weeks?
It is complicated. Take your telescope in your analysis and zero it in. Tell us what's happening with vaccine distribution in Philadelphia.
Well, the Philadelphia Department of Public Health announced this week that people in Category 1C can start getting vaccinated Monday, April 12th, and literally everyone else can start getting vaccinated on April 19th.
So what's the significance of that announcement? Who's in 1C?
The city is prioritizing, and rightly so, some more frontline workers in Category 1C who didn't fit into Categories 1A and 1B. And we've been vaccinating 1A and 1B since probably the beginning of January. So 1C, these are sanitation workers, utility workers, taxi drivers, rideshare drivers, and frontline retail workers who have not been eligible before, but they are. You can tell from that list that these are public-facing employees who need to get vaccinated.
Right.
Everyone else in Category 1C will be eligible on April 12th, and then everyone not in any of these categories, 1A, 1B, or 1C, they become eligible on April 19th. So, if you haven't been, in those categories, you can start making your appointment on April 19th. And frankly, we can stop talking about categories, and we can just focus on the vaccination message, which is a little less confusing.
It would be incredibly helpful, and I appreciate you saying that it's confusing, and you were really clear, but it is confusing. People don't know what category they're in, and no matter how much we communicators try to let them know, they don't walk around thinking, well, I'm a 1C person or I'm a 1A person. So here's another point of confusion. What do you do to get vaccinated? Can you just walk up to a vaccination site?
Not quite yet. While there are some walk-up opportunities for some residents in certain neighborhoods and at some sites, the vast majority of people still need to register on the city's portal at www.phila.gov and fill out the vaccine interest form. If you don't have internet access or you're not comfortable making the appointment that way, making the request that way, we urge you to call Philly 311, where someone will help you get registered. Your information will be kept confidential and only used to contact you for your vaccine appointment. That is a big concern for a lot of people.
That's good to know. That's good. I only have one other question I can think of on vaccines for now. Any estimate on when a majority of Philadelphians will be vaccinated? And underneath that is what that might mean for when the city can really reopen.
It's a big question. Obviously, you and I have been talking about this for several months about, whether people who are better at math than you or I can have been able to calculate, when the vast majority of Philadelphians will be vaccinated based on the rate at which people are being vaccinated at any given point. At this point, Dr. Tom Farley estimated that a majority of Philadelphians will be vaccinated by the end of June. I know it seems like a long way off, but that we have to keep moving forward, and it's closer than you think.
It does seem like a long way off, but I appreciate you answering the question. Let's switch gears just because we have to before we get to our guest. The city will unveil a new budget for the city next Thursday, April 15th. Now we know that the mayor proposes and then council considers the budget, holds multiple hearings, takes testimony from all the departments, and then decides and votes on the budget. We don't know exactly what issues are going to drive the budget debate yet, but I think we can hazard a couple of guesses. I'll start and then, maybe you can chime in. I think police funding will be a huge debate this year. What reforms are coming to the department after all the unrest here and around the country over the last year? What programs and funding will the department ask for specifically to deal with the gun violence epidemic that is all around us in the city? Pandemic recovery relief and funding. Now, we know this is happening already. Council's been approving millions of dollars in new normal job spending on various programs. The Commerce Department's been heavily involved with various programs to help small businesses that have gotten hit really hard. I think we'll hear a lot about that. Public health spending. I could see a big debate. Interesting to hear what you think, over making sure the health department is slightly better prepared to handle the next mass virus event if and when that comes to Philadelphia. I'll stop there. What do you think?
I think you hit the three big ones. Police spending and reforms will be huge hearings, and I'm sure a lot of eyes in Philadelphia will be on those hearings. Let me add in funding for the district attorney's office. There's been a lot of debate over the DA's office and its role in prosecuting gun crimes in Philadelphia. That will absolutely come up. That will be a much watched hearing. On the pandemic recovery, yes, council's already been busy. The New Normal Jobs Initiative allocated $9 million this year so far, and programs that clean up vacant lots in city neighborhoods and put people to work. I'm going to give a shout out to Councilmembers Kathy Gilmore Richardson and Majority Leader Sherelle Parker for their work on some of those programs. We anticipate we'll hear more on those. And I think we'll also hear a lot of debate on what the city can do to stimulate job growth and encourage businesses to return to the city and help some of the businesses that were damaged by the pandemic recover.
I think that's a huge one. I'm glad you brought that up. I'll throw one more big one into the mix: public education. And we know the American Rescue Plan from the Biden administration and Congress means $1.3 billion more is coming to the school district of Philadelphia. But I could still see a huge debate over exactly how the district spends that money. What do you think?
Absolutely. The district has strong supporters and skeptics on council, and I can see council members on both sides wanting real detailed answers and plans from the district and Superintendent Height on how they plan to spend this additional $1.3 billion on Philadelphia's children, and also how they plan to allocate some of that money to fund some of the much needed building repairs. Much of the debate about when students could go back into Philadelphia school buildings during this pandemic centered around the condition of our school buildings. So that is absolutely going to be a factor in this discussion. Huge
issue. And I'm glad you brought it up. So, the pace of the pandemic, the urgent need to get everybody vaccinated, the looming budget debate. We never lack for things to talk about on this podcast, and to me, that's why I really enjoy doing it with you. But we'd like you to introduce our very special guest for this week.
Absolutely. We are closing out our, freshman 4 mini series of our freshman council members with
Nice.
Councilmember Kendra Brooks. Yes, Councilmember Brooks made history in 2019 when she became the first person elected to council in Philadelphia who was not a member of a major party, Republican or Democrat, in over 100 years. She is a member of the Working Families Party. She's a former education activist, as you'll hear her talk about in a moment. She's a passionate advocate for Philadelphia residents who feel they've been voiceless in the past, lower income workers, frontline workers, the homeless, and many other constituencies. She has a lot to say and a really unique voice on council. So we're really looking forward to the conversation with her, which you will hear after the break.
Thanks, Patty.
Thanks, Joe.
Like what you're hearing? Be sure to subscribe to Inside PHL Council on your favorite podcast app.
Welcome back to Inside PHL Council. I'm Joe Grace, Communications Director for Council, here with my colleague Patty Gillette, our Deputy Communications Director, and today our special guest, Councilmember Kendra Brooks. Councilmember, good afternoon and welcome to Inside PHL Council.
Good afternoon, and thank you all for having me.
We're really happy to have you here. We're going to dive right into it because you do a lot of work, and that's why we're excited to have you on. And we have what we hope are some interesting questions for our listeners about all the work you've been doing over this first year plus in City Council. I'll start off, and I'm going to ask you that, or I think I'll just raise that just months into your first term last year, you were one of the first city leaders to introduce legislation that was directly aimed or targeted at pandemic relief. Your Public Health Emergency Leave Act provided paid sick leave benefits to essential workers who were excluded from the first Coronavirus Response Act. Your bill passed and it took effect last September, and it sunsetted at the end of the year. Now, you recently led a successful effort to reinstate the provisions of the bill this year, 2021. Can you explain to us how the bill helped and continues to help Philadelphians who are directly impacted by this pandemic?
Sure. I think the number one thing, it allows caregivers who are balancing work and childcare to stay home if the children's daycare or school is closed as a result of COVID-19. That's one of the things, which is huge because there are so many, working families that childcare is a number one issue. And during COVID, we saw many childcare centers closing or they were open and had to close up because of exposure. Also, people who have worked in person during the pandemic have been, disproportionately low wage workers and people of color. So we realized that those essential workers that we're talking about have contracted COVID-19 at a rate that's 55% higher than those who were able to stay home. And, that's a huge number. And that was very concerning because majority of my neighbors are essential workers and don't work from home. And these workers, they continue to keep our city growing, even when we were at the worst of the pandemic. And I felt that we need to do more than just pay them lip service by saying thank you and all the signs that we saw going up. That was very good. But we need to show them, our appreciation by the way we care. And part of care is taking action. So, we realized that many of these folks were the folks that couldn't afford to stay home because they couldn't afford to miss a paycheck. And also without any adequate paid sick leave, they would be sick. Or could be sick or be exposed to sickness. So it was important for us to offer something to allow folks, if you're exposed to COVID, to be able to stay home and still be able to maintain your family. Because if you have to make a choice between going to work and not eating or not feeding your family, you're going to go to work. But we realize that when workers can afford to stay home, that we are not just protecting those workers. We're protecting the public as well. We're protecting everyone. So fighting for this paid sick leave to me was a reminder on how important, the labor movement is in the city and why it's important for us to have robust worker protections, to keep our most vulnerable community members safe, because we realize our most vulnerable community members are also essential workers. So that was the significance. The main thing was that, folks, if you're sick, you're able to stay home. If you're exposed, you're able to stay home. And that's a public health. That's like an essential for public health. And I think that's why, I know that for me, that's why it was important to fight for it. Because so many of my neighbors, I see them leaving for work every day, and we needed to protect everyone. So that's why it was major. Like, the paid sick leave was like huge for me as a worker protection. As a former essential worker, I used to be a nursing assistant, so I know what it's like to have those hourly jobs that if you don't make your client and you can't go, you don't get paid.
Very, very thoughtful response. I'm curious, before I ask you a couple follow-ups, just listening to you makes me wonder. Your neighbors, as you point out, a number of them are frontline essential workers. Do they know about this bill? And not that you did this to get praise from them, but do they know what this legislation does?
Yes, actually, I thought we were going to have to do more promoting of it. I think we just needed to promote how to access it, like how to make sure that your employer knows how to get it. Because my neighbors, my next door neighbor, my immediate neighbor is a security guard. The one house down, he is a cook. And then he was out of work for an extended period of time, and he ended up being a security guard with my other neighbor. She got him a job in security. So, they knew about it. And actually, folks actually stopped me on the street and know about the paid sick leave. Sometimes they have the details a little misconstrued, but I thought I would have to do more to get the word out to the people, but people really, grab hold to this. Because keep in mind, I did a ride along with sanitation, and that was the majority of the folks had something to say about schools being closed and being able to access childcare for their children during COVID. And if they were exposed to COVID and their kids were also exposed to COVID, they had to stay home and take care of their kids. Kids go to the daycare, get exposed at the daycare. Now they still have to take off work because the kids can't stay home by themselves. So it was like a overwhelmingly requested piece of legislation that folks didn't know they needed it until they did.
That's a great, go ahead, I'm sorry, no, forgive me.
Which was surprising to me. They didn't know they needed it until they did. Like, people were out 2, 3, 4 different occasions because of COVID exposures, like folks that are essential workers. So it became a huge thing, and folks, word of mouth is how it spread, I think, mostly.
That's great feedback, and that's got to be gratifying for you and your team, your staff, that the word of mouth is getting out there and that people really do know about this, this essential piece of legislation. Well, let me ask you a follow-up. So in crafting this bill for essential frontline workers, your office has worked closely with the people and the organizations really who kept this city running during the worst months of the pandemic last year. Now that we've entered the vaccination phase and hope appears to be moving toward normalcy, we hope, right? Can you tell us, a little more? You kind of did just answer this a little bit, but of what you're hearing from some of the groups and the people that you were working with as you developed this legislation.
Well, let me start. Early on, it was a lot of difficulties trying to help people understand who the essential workers were and making sure those people were at the beginning of the line when we started talking about vaccination, and make sure we had more access to vaccination, just like in the beginning when we were talking about testing, making sure we had more access to testing. So vaccination and testing kind of has been a similar experience. But, I think we should be proud that we made progress. We've made a lot of progress with the work with Dr. Ala Stanford and the Black COVID-19 consortiums, and we should be thankful for that. But we still have a long way to go. We need to make sure that we're prioritizing super zip codes that have been most impacted by COVID. I live in 19140, which is on that list. We need to make sure that we're expanding these community-based vaccination effort in neighborhoods because people don't want to travel. A lot of our conversations be like, was saying that folks should be close to public transportation, which is all good. But I don't know if you rode public transportation lately. People aren't catching a bus. People are afraid to be in those shared settings. Although SEPTA has done a good job of, trying to keep things up, people are afraid. So the more vaccination locations that we can have in neighborhoods, especially those neighborhoods with the highest rate of exposure to COVID, I think we would be able to do a much better job. And I think that we're working on that. I think we have to continue to build trust with the workers and communities because, keep in mind, Black and brown poor communities do not trust vaccination. Just the thought of vaccination is always been a taboo and still is. So, folks are most likely to get the vaccine when it comes from folks that they trust, like reliable, within the neighborhood, rather than go somewhere unfamiliar outside of their comfort zone. And I think, as our city progresses into the 1C phase of the vaccination, I think it's important that we partner. We partner with employers and churches and pharmacies and community centers just to reduce the barriers to getting this vaccine, and hope we can vaccinate as many people as possible. And we started to reach out to Walgreens and Rite Aid and all these other things and share that information through our council colleagues to make sure that we're doing that. I think we just have to think outside the box. This has never happened before, and traditional methods of doing things aren't working because we see that folks aren't getting vaccinated. So we have to bring it to them. And I think we have to be creative and really build community. We're a city of neighborhoods, right? If we know that we're a city of neighborhoods, the best way to handle vaccination is neighborhood by neighborhood and use trusted partners. And I think that's the way to go. So I think we're moving in the right direction. But I still would like to see, because I know throughout North Philly, the numbers are low. So we still need to do more to get in churches and mosques just to make sure that we're able to hit as many people as possible.
I think you're right about
1C, especially with the 1C, because, there are folks that weren't in those categories that wanted to get vaccinated that were being turned away for whatever reason. We need to make sure that we're letting folks, if they want to be vaccinated and they're in these zip codes, let them be vaccinated.
You wonder if we don't need to get, we're not the public health director. We understand that, but your very thoughtful response, it makes me think of right now you have to be registered. That's it. You have to be registered on the city portal. But when they did the walk-in approach at the convention center a few weeks ago, people responded, with the targeted zip codes. And you wonder if we don't need to get, to a walk-up approach sooner rather than later.
I think in order for us to see what we need to see as the weather increases and folks want to get outside, I think, like I said, we have to think outside the box. And if we're going to do smaller walk-up clinics in neighborhoods, I think we should do it.
Great feedback. So I just have one more question for you before I turn it over to my colleague, Patty, to ask you yet some more questions. So the budget cycle is upon us. I guess the mayor will deliver his budget address next week to you and your colleagues in council. And we certainly hope that this budget will be largely about how the city recovers from this pandemic. Based on all your work to date, what do you think and hope that an equitable recovery should look like in Philadelphia?
Well, you absolutely know that for me, when I think about equitable recovery, it means investing in housing and education and parks and recreation and infrastructure. It means that we need to think about what's possible and just rejecting a whole austerity mindset that says that we can't. We're so used to saying we can't do this and we can't do that. However, this pandemic has shown us that there are several cracks in our social safety nets. And if we want to get beyond the pandemic, we need to fill those gaps, and make sure that when we're talking about the haves and the have-nots, the folks that have nots are stabilized in our community, because we'll continue to see the decline and we'll continue to see poverty grow. And what that looks like, we need to ensure that our young people have safe neighborhoods to grow up in, with pathways to higher education and gainful employment. So workforce development is important. The free higher education with CCP is going to be important, but we still need to expand what that looks like because our children had 2 years worth of learning loss. So what does that mean for our 10th, 11th, and 12th graders that are planning their next step into either a trade or into higher education? But we're going to ask them to get in debt to bring their grades up to par in order to do these programs, which that shouldn't be the way. We need to make sure that we're giving them a smooth transition to success because that's the future economy. If we don't invest in our young people, we're not investing in our economy. Everyone wants to, I get a lot of pushback when I talk about the people, working people. We have to support our businesses as well. But our next entrepreneurs and business leaders are these same young folks that are coming out of school right now, out of high school, out of our Philadelphia public schools, and we need to make those investments. Also, I do feel that, as we get into the budget season, I know that I ran on the platform and I was talking about housing, education, parks and recs, but like being very clear on what that looks like just throwing money into a pit. We have to make sure that we're doing some alignment. So, when we think about like how we align services within the city, we need to make sure that folks are talking to each other. This push towards education and parks and recs and young people and DHS, it has to be a collective move. When we start talking about housing and the funding that's coming down the pipe, we need to make sure that, we're keeping people stabilized in homes, preventing homelessness, because keep in mind, if my focus is going to be young people, homeless young folks have the hardest time transitioning into education and parks and recs. We find like a large number of our children that end up in trouble come from some of these same households. So like when I talking about building an investment, this investment is in the future of Philadelphia, but we have to look at a whole family model, so housing is important, is number one. And making sure our schools are ready for this transition, because when we go back into a building, this pandemic, people don't talk about it. It has been traumatizing. Social isolation is a real thing. Just imagine social isolation added to poverty, right? So then we have these young people that are going back into the building. Some were on a computer, some didn't. Some were able to get on online school, some weren't. Everybody had a different way of making it happen. And we put them back in the building together with no plan to work on their social emotional needs. Then they're going back into these neighborhoods that is always something going on. So like those investments are the things. So when I know it's not my job to get into the nitty gritty. However, I thought it was important for me to begin having conversations with these various agencies to make sure they're talking to each other. So once again, we're not just throwing money at a problem. We can easily throw money, but if it doesn't land in the right way, we end up back in the same situations.
I think your voice and you diving into the nitty gritty, as you put it, is exactly, in my opinion, why the voters of Philadelphia, we're going to get into that in a minute, sent you as a different kind of candidate to city council. That's my 2 cents. I'm going to turn it, thank you, council member. I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Patty Gillette, who has a number of different questions.
Hi, council member. And I mean, a lot of what you said just now resonated with me, but one of the things that you mentioned was talking about some of the gaps that the gaps in our structure, in our social structure and our political structure that the pandemic exposed. And with that in mind, last week in City Council, you introduced legislation to amend the city's code to provide protections for individuals affected by domestic violence, a particular form of domestic violence known as coercive control. Can you elaborate on what coercive control is and how the city's existing code can fall short in protecting individuals who are unfortunately in these types of relationships?
Coercive control, is a form of domestic abuse, and it can take on a number of forms, including, limiting a person's movement, like where you can and cannot go, your communications, taking your phone or your devices, obstructing your daily behavior, controlling your money, as well as your access to services. And it can also include manipulating the other person by force. So that's the threat of force, intimidation, including, threats based on immigration status. And currently the city's code only extends protections for people who are victims of physical abuse. But we know that abuse can take on many different forms. And, that coercive control often leads to more deadly forms of violence. But that currently, our code doesn't give folks the ability to escape abuse based on that. So the legislation expands this definition of domestic violence and domestic abuse in several sections of the city code to cover, these often overlooked forms of abuse, and it ensures that survivors, have protections to the supports and help they need to stay safe.
When you introduced this legislation in council, you mentioned that it was in honor of a family member who you tragically lost to intimate partner violence. Would you like to speak more about her life and what you think people can learn from your family's experience in this?
Absolutely. So this piece of legislation is inspired by my cousin Tiana. She was murdered by her partner 8 years ago to the date I introduced the legislation. Tiana's death saved the life of another family member. So Tiana had ran into another family member of mine who had a black eye. They were on the subway actually get restraining orders together. And she encouraged my other family member to leave and don't go back. And now we realize that was something that she wasn't able to do herself, because I think 2 days or maybe the day after that, she ended up being killed in her home by her partner. But my other family member never went back. So this is huge for me because this legislation is in honor of Tiana's memory and folks like her in these circumstances that find it impossible to leave their abusers. And there's so many survivors suffering silence. Like, how do you explain this to someone? And I hope that these protections will help people who experience domestic violence leave their abusers, get the help they need, and ultimately save their lives. So I got through it. I thought I was going to get choked up, but it's very huge to me. When Tiana died, I told my family members that, it wouldn't be in vain and I would do something in her honor. At the time, I thought it was going to be some breast cancer awareness event that was hosted by my family. I never would have thought, years later, we'll be introducing legislation in her honor with the thought of saving the lives of more folks that are going through domestic violence.
Well, I think if you did get choked up, any of us on this call, anyone listening would understand. Unfortunately, so many of us have been touched by domestic violence, including those of us in council. As you probably are aware, in 2018, council lost a city staffer to domestic violence. I remember the day that we found out. Her name was Linda Rios, and we all shared in that loss, and we all, anytime we encounter an opportunity to remember her and remember those lost to domestic violence, we try to be aware. So we are, looking forward to the hearings on this so we can raise more awareness about this issue. I distinctly remember the year that Linda passed away. She was the 21st person in Philadelphia killed by an intimate partner. When you introduced the legislation, you mentioned that calls to Philadelphia's domestic violence hotline were up, I believe you said 30% over the course of the pandemic, because unfortunately, one of the things we learned that there were Philadelphia residents who were, stuck at home, quarantined with their abusers. So I think this is a good time for us to drop in, number one, the Philly Domestic Violence Hotline, which is 866-723-3014. Again, that's 866-723-3014. I'll drop that in the show notes. But just anything else you wanted to mention about this, the importance of this legislation in light of the fact that, we've seen this increased demand on our domestic violence resources?
No, I think we just need to make sure that we put it out there, because I think so often folks have cried out for help and were turned away because it wasn't physical abuse. So we need to make sure that folks know loud and clear that we're trying to change that and allow opportunities for folks to get out of these relationships before they become violent. The majority of the issues that I fight for with my council seat now are things that have affected my life personally. And my passion is grounded in lived experience, not theory, not I heard. Is that I shed these tears before. And a lot of times I'm rehashing my own trauma and healing in this process. So for me, like, a lot of this legislation is healing, because I wish we didn't have to lose Tiana. When I fight for housing, I wish I didn't lose my house. Like, it's so many things that would have been different had I known. And I feel like with this opportunity that I have to make the best of it. And the best way to get people to listen and understand is for me to show, as they say in church, show my wounds. Like, I've been through this personally, and this is part of the healing process. So I'm really honored to actually be in a position to really move on these issues. And that's what gives me joy. That's the thing that gives me joy, being in city council right now.
What a great response.
Well, with that in mind, I mean, I think that's a good transition into what I think is my final question. You ran for city council, and your background was as an activist, in education and gun violence. And you mentioned earlier your previous work as a healthcare worker. So all of those have served you well, certainly in the last year. But even prior to that, you made history, because in the history of City of Philadelphia's modern legislature, starting in 1919, all of the seats in Philadelphia City Council had been held by members of the two major parties, Republican or Democrat. And that changed in 2020 when you were sworn in as the first council member representing a third party, in this case, the Working Families Party. Now, much has already been asked and written about what this has meant for the city and potentially for third parties nationwide. So we kind of want to ask you about governing. Now that you have a year under your belt as a council member, what have you learned about about the operations of council and the operations of city government with respect to third party leaders like yourself?
Wow. I think one thing I think has served me well is that I was a restorative practitioner. I travel around the country teaching restorative practices. And when you think about how restorative practice work, it talks about working with people. We don't do things to people. We don't do things for people, right? We work with people. And that has been my way of governing as a third party. Like, I know that I'm pushing the envelope of what is politically possible. I know that I'm pushing folks outside of their comfort zone around some of the issues that I fight for. But I'm seeing other council members do the same thing as well. When I think about my freshman 4 colleagues, we brought, new energy and new enthusiasm, but it's part of us working together, and not having support from a major political party. It can be challenging when it comes to like acclimating to like the inner workings of city politics. I made it very clear, like, I wasn't deeply involved in politics. I was an activist, which is still political, but I didn't understand how party dynamics work. But also, being a third party, I have my advantages as well, because I don't have to fall into that system as well. So I think having the ability to like go against the grain, but also work with people to help them see how things are possible and how we work together, we're all working towards the same common good. So I still consider myself a movement candidate. So although I'm not a Democrat and I'm not a Republican, I have strong relationships with communities and organizers, some of which are Democrats, even a few Republicans. And it just gives us the opportunity to have a new roadmap when it comes to not just elections here in the city, but also what it means to govern and what does that look like. So I think for me, I find great pleasure to say I was elected so that working people can have a seat at the table. And I made that my priority, working people. So the issues that I listen to, the issues that I fight for, even the way I fight for them is grounded in the neighborhoods my neighborhood, neighborhoods like mine around the city, grounded in, I was a former 1199C worker, my partner was an SEIU worker, that's like deep roots around this work. And also, my daughter Zion is a up and coming activist, and making sure that we include young people as part of these conversations, because once again, they are our future. And if we don't show them something better than the systems that we created or our parents created before them, we can be in big trouble. Young people won't allow us to put them in a box. So we need to give them the ability to grow and thrive and create this democracy that we want to see for our city. And currently, both political systems, party systems, don't necessarily do that. When I think about in my neighborhood, when we go through how like the politics work and who works the polls, it's mostly seniors. Nothing against the seniors. We need their wisdom and we need their grace. However, if we don't raise up the next level, the next generation of leaders in this city, we're going to be at a loss. Running as a third party candidate gave me the opportunity to highlight that conversation and highlight that opportunity because, I have children ranging from ages now 13. My babies are grown up, 13 to 31. Many of their friends didn't vote, didn't believe in the political system, thought it was all a bunch of, crap. Like, we don't care. I promised them, if I win this election, it's proof that every vote counts. That's what I told them. That's what I told my daughters. I told them to tell their friends. After I won the election, I was on the subway going into City Hall. I ran into a young woman and she was like, they call me Miss Nikki. Miss Nikki. I'm going to use her same term. Yo, Miss Nikki, you really won. Now we got to get the president. I ain't never voted a day in my life. This is the first time I ever voted. And now I know my vote counts. That meant a lot to me. And that's the message that she's going to share with other young folks who say politics is rigged and your vote doesn't count. So that's what this third party opportunity has done for young people, done for disadvantaged communities, and, kind of changed the mindset of a lot of other folks that we can try something different and we have to be bold and we have to work together. So that's what excited me about running as a third party candidate. And that's the same thing that kind of keeps me grounded into why this is important.
And I'm going to circle back. That was fantastic, and I love the idea of people being engaged. My husband is a teacher. He's a social studies teacher in Philadelphia public schools, and this is the kind of messaging he tries to do with them every day when he teaches AP student government and tries to convince them, like, yes, it does matter what people do, especially on the local level, because unfortunately, our media tends to just pay attention to the national politics, but on the local level, caring about what happens on the local level is what brings about the change that you see in your neighborhoods. I listen to what you say and your optimism and your feeling about being a third party candidate. And I want to circle back to Joe's original question about, you being one of the first people to hit the ground running with pandemic relief. And I wonder if those two things are connected. Do you think that your status as being outside some of the large political structures helped you to see what was necessary to do right off the bat in the pandemic?
Yeah, because I didn't have a playbook. Like, I didn't know what I was supposed to do, but I felt I needed to do something. I think the most moving thing, the two things that moved me the most, the day City Hall closed, right before the building didn't allow other folks to come in.
March 15th.
March 15th, a business owner came from South Philly Barbacoa. He came in my office and he was like, what am I supposed to do? What is this going to look like for my employees in my business? Now, keep in mind, I'm 3 months in. I didn't have a clue. Let me call one of my colleagues who I know is deeply grounded in the business community that can help you with that. But that was my first trigger. Like, this is something serious. This maybe about 2 weeks in, I got a phone call from one of my former employees before. Never has been unemployed. Her job closed. No pay. Didn't know what to do. She needed food for her and her adult daughter. Never had to ask anybody for anything. Me and my staff came out of our pockets for like the first month buying groceries for folks. And it was people that never had to use the system before. We spent so much time helping people just figure out how to apply for unemployment and figure out how to get food stamps before I even figured out how to connect to, share food and cupboards and kitchens and stuff. Because keep in mind, I'm only 3 months in. I didn't have a clue on how you do this as a government official. I know how to do it as a movement person. We get to the ground, we raise money and feed people, right? But those are the things that kind of provoked me that I had to do something. I couldn't just sit back and wait to figure it out. So my do something was, like I said, feeding people, taking calls. I had one person call me also she had 3 jobs, hospitality jobs, all closed within a month. She had just bought a house. Her daughter was also a service worker. She was like, what am I supposed to do? I said this in another interview. My staff was like, well, what are we supposed to do? You know, these people need to do something. And I think it was the first time my staff and I realized that we are these people. Like, we're in city government, we're political, we're politicians, we're political figures. We had to figure out what to do. And everything that we did was based on direct phone calls from folks asking me to do something. And it wasn't good enough for me to say, I don't know what to do. It's my job to find solutions. And when we did, myself, Councilmember Gim and Councilmember Gautier, when we did the Emergency Housing Protection Act, it was still grounded in people couldn't pay their rent. When we started calling around to utilities about, you know, a moratorium on shutoffs and all that, is because people were calling about utilities. And when we started talking about paid sick leave, it's because people were going to work sick. People were losing their jobs because they couldn't find people to watch their kids. And I think the scariest thing, when a parent is put in a position to put their kids in an unsafe situation just to go to work, that's a call to do something.
I think all of that is, I mean, I'm grateful for this conversation. It's in the detail of this conversation, council member, because I think that, number one, you're helping us live up to our name. The name of this podcast is Inside PHL Council, and people are actually seeing what you guys do every day and what you did in the worst parts of the pandemic to help the citizens of Philadelphia, and what the other members did. But I mean, I think these conversations are good to have as we go into the next budget cycle, and just really think about the lessons that we learned from the pandemic and how we can turn those into action. Do you agree, Joe?
I do. And I think that, you know, that answer that the council member just gave us, the thought that went through my mind was, you're listening to the metamorphosis of a movement activist into an elected official in Philadelphia, representing the people that she fought for and still fights for, but now from a different perch, that of an elected official in city council. And my last comment is just that I hope that as we enter the budget debate in just a little more than a week, I don't think anybody has to hope that we're going to see your passion, but if you keep bringing the same vigor and passion and ideas and rooting yourself to people who really live in our communities, your voice is a very unique voice in this council, and I really look forward to hearing it during the budget debate.
Thank you. I'm expecting to have a lot to say.
That's
no
fantastic.
doubt.
We look forward to it. We look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thank you so much, council member. This has been a great discussion.
Absolutely.
Thank you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you.
Visit our website, phlcouncil.com, where you can subscribe to this show, get contact information for each council office, learn more about our legislation, and find dates for upcoming hearings and meetings. Follow us on social media. We're PHL Council on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. If you enjoyed this show, we'd appreciate a rating on iTunes, Google Podcasts, or your favorite podcast app. Inside PHL Council is produced by Philadelphia City Council. This episode is adjourned to the call of the next upload. Thanks for listening.